In our group chat, Pastor Judith speaks about the story of Elijah and the widow. What a beautiful story that was. And actually, I hope you all were able to read all of Elijah's story that was assigned this week, because it's such a fascinating story. It's one that holds our attention. It's exciting. It's powerful. At times it's sad, but at times it's filled with adventure and hope. It's powerful, but particularly the story of Elijah and the widow speaks so deeply to all of us who feel like we're at the end of our ropes, as if there's no hope left. And then God kind of steps in. I love that story. God instructing the widow to feed a man of God and the resurrection of her son. Absolutely. It was amazing that this widow was really kind of she had already just given up all hope, and then and God stepped in through Elijah, bringing Elijah into her midst. Beautiful, beautiful story. Anyone else? Is there anyone else that is willing to share or is able to share? Please unmute to raise your hand. For those of you who are just connecting into the class, we are opening the class with our standard question of what stood out to you as particularly meaningful from this week's reading. We've talked about Elijah and the widow and the widow's son. We've also talked about Isaiah in chapter 6. Can someone else share what stood out to you?
Hello.
Yes, Pastor Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Rachelle. These readings for today, for today's class, have been so great and touching. But what stood out for me, I want to bring up the story of Naboth's mother for his own vineyard. But we can see how Jezebel is making this plot by proclaiming a fast, so that people come in the name of fasting, people come in the name of prayer, people come together to seek God. But when there is a conspiracy that is going on, when some people are devising their own means to kill someone, and I was pondering so much how the devil could eat up people in a way that Jezebel could even get those volunteers to say, yes, we'll make this deal for you. We shall stand there. We'll work it out. We know it will work. So I see some people coming to worship with the right heart, maybe to seek God. But I see some other people coming to make a plan to kill Naboth. I wonder how the devil could eat up the hearts of people to that level. And I want to say that we need to be so much careful in this. The devil can go as deep as that. And by the end of the conference, if we could call it a conference or a prayer retreat, by the end of it, someone was dead. By the end of that, someone was dead, and his property had been taken, his estate had been taken, just like that. But can imagine how the devil could do that amid these people who say, we are worshiping God. So that one stood out for me. And I want to go deep, wondering about it, and then also warn our people, if they have to be warned by the devil, at least not to go beyond those lines. That was too much. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you so much for sharing, Pastor Stephen. What stands out to me hearing from you all that have shared is how fascinating it is that when we ask the question, what stood out to you as meaningful or powerful? What stood out to you as something to be remembered? We have such different understandings and ideas. What strikes me as powerful or meaningful is so different from someone else. Or we've heard, 3 or 4 different portions of what we read, and they're all vastly different. And I think that is part of the beauty and part of the reason why we share and we read in community. We study the Word of God as a people of God, as a community, because what is going to stand out to one person might be totally different from another person. But look at all that we can learn and how God can focus our attention in on different areas of His holy word. And so we learn together. We see different perspectives, and that only helps increase our ability and equips us for ministry, because we're not ministering to just one person. We're coming at ministry to groups and communities where there's going to be a lot of different ideas and understandings. What speaks deeply to one person will be completely different to another person. And so being able to hear all of this is why we open each class with the question of what stood out to you, is so that we can see different areas that we may have overlooked or may not have seen, or may not seem particularly relevant to us at this moment in time in our lives, but maybe it will 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Or maybe when we come upon a story that this resonates. So right now, thinking, for example, if the story of Elijah and the widow stood out as meaningful, powerful to you, that could be something that relates deeply to your heart. And think about the people that you preach to, the people that you teach, the people that you minister to. You're going to have a lot of folks that are going to feel a great sense of God's presence when they hear a story about God bringing a person to step into a widow's grief and utter despair and bring her hope and the presence of God. Now that's going to preach. That's going to preach to a lot of your people, because a lot of our people have felt that despair, that moment in life where they feel like it's all over. There's no hope left. There's nothing left to hope for. It's all done. I'm just going to resign myself to die. That will speak to our people, to a lot of our people. The same way with some of the other stories, when we think about maybe even the story of Isaiah and his commissioning, that's going to speak to some people that have experienced God in a way that they have felt or heard or understood God calling them into service to bring glory to the kingdom. And the more we kind of look at some of these stories, the better we can help preach and teach and relate. And it makes us better ministers of God's word when we can sit and share and study all of this as a community and a family of faith. So thank you, everyone who has shared. And I look forward, as we go through the class, to hearing more of your thoughts and your discussions, because every thought and discussion can come to help increase the edifications, the equipping of us who are called by God to serve in his name. So thank you all. This week's reading was, I hope you found that there was a lot within this reading that really spoke to what the people of Israel went through, and how these stories really serve to kind of build up to, you start to see the foundations being laid for how the Israelites came to be the way they were. We really begin to see the beginnings of these Hebrew people, and how the coming destruction that would be prophesied by multiple prophets, how that was coming to be. It wasn't something that happened quickly. It wasn't something that happened overnight. God, and we read this in our reading this week, God spoke through multiple people words of warning, even in his anger at their disobedience, at their unfaithfulness to him and the covenant between him and his people. He still provided warnings for them out of his great love and mercy. So let's kind of jump right in. And we really had kind of a very focused look at the role of prophets in this week's readings. As you'll remember, when we read through our Old Testament, we quickly see that there are different roles of leadership for the Hebrew people. First and foremost, that might come to mind would be the role of the priests. The priests were definitely in a place of leadership, and they were those who would have been born from the tribe of Levi. They would have been born in the lineage of Aaron, Moses's brother. They were the Levites. And Aaron was the first high priest. His sons followed after him. But we see the priest as being this intermediary between God and humanity. It was the priest that brought about redemption, that brought about atonement for the people whenever they had fallen away, whenever they had sinned, either personally or as a community. It was the priest that brought God and humanity back together through their priestly duties in the tabernacle and then later the temple, the more permanent structure that was first seen in the tabernacle. So we recognize the priest as having this role of leadership. Then the role of king. Remember, Israel did not receive their first king until Saul, which was around 1,000 years prior to Christ, about 1000 BC, or just a little bit before then. But an easy way to remember that is about 1,000 years before Christ. That's when we see the monarchy come to be for Israel, a political king, a military king, a nation's king. And the kings of Israel, the kings for the people of God, were really to hold something of a multi-dimensional role. Because one, they were supposed to be a political leader. They were to govern and to be just. They were called to be military leaders for sure, but they were also supposed to take on the full leadership of keeping the people in alignment to the covenant of God. They were to make sure that their nation, the nation of God, that they were to remain faithful to their covenant, to be faithful to Yahweh God and Yahweh God alone. Now, we began to see in this week's reading, and we'll see it throughout the rest of the Old Testament, that as kings come and go through both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, some kings were good and some kings were bad. And it's often phrased when we are introduced to new kings in either the north or the south, we'll read phrases that sound something like, King so-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord, or King so-and-so walked with the Lord. But more times than not, the kings would, oftentimes the kings of Israel or Judah, north or south kingdom, would often do evil in the sight of the Lord. And it was primarily because they led the people astray. They allowed idol worship into the kingdom. They allowed paganism. They would often marry foreign wives that would bring in their own form of religion through idol worship, pagan worship. And oftentimes when that happened, the kings of the nations of Israel would oftentimes erect altars or temples for these pagan gods and just really, truly allow absolute just an absolute apostasy and rejection. That's probably the best and strongest word, an absolute rejection of God as their one true God, their one and only. So that's kind of where we're going. So we see these roles of leadership through the priests, through the kings. And this week we were really introduced more fully into the third role of leadership in Israel. And that is of the role of prophet. Prophets were both men and women. But what we have in written record is mostly the male prophets. And they were men that were particularly anointed by God to bring a message. In its purest form, a prophet can be said to be a spokesperson for God, giving oracles. A divine word would be an oracle, a word specifically given from a divine God, our God, Yahweh. They would give words from God, either speaking for God, calling people back to him, giving words of warning, and sometimes really showing them what the consequences could look like. And I think it's important to remember that prophets were not always necessarily talking about what might happen in the future. A lot of the oracles that we have from our prophets are the prophets of God just really calling the people of Israel, of both north or south kingdoms, to remember their God, to turn back to him, saying that they were encouraging the people, turn back to God, relaying messages from him, reminding them who God was. And then what we'll see in the next few weeks is really the prophets saying, calling people out, particularly the kings, going before the kings of the nation and saying, look, here's where you're going wrong. This is what God says. You're doing this wrong, and this wrong, and y'all need to stop it. You need to turn back to God and that covenant and be faithful to that covenant, the covenant of God. And so this is where we're really introduced to the role of prophet amongst the people of God. So we have priests, kings, and prophets as the three primary leadership roles amongst the Israelite people. And we'll come to see that all three of these roles of leadership will ultimately see fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we'll see Jesus Christ really coming in as a true high priest, a true king, and the true prophet of God, or the one who is anointed to speak for and of God. So as we dive in, we'll look a little bit at the prophets and their messages for the people that we read this week. I think it's important to understand that the prophets themselves, they understood the tension between the existing, the tension that existed between Israel's religion and all of the pagan practices of the people group surrounding them. They had a lot of neighbors living there amongst them that were pagans. And the prophets understood exactly what this meant for the people. Also, the prophets clearly discerned the difference between a righteous and faithful people and a popular and comfortable religion. In their finest moments, the prophets called the people of God to remember their deep roots. And we heard this in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where Micah speaks for God, saying, what the Lord requires from you, do justice, embrace faithful love, and walk humbly with your God. This is a message that he's giving to the people. And I want you to notice what he's not saying. He's not saying, walk with pride, walk pridefully, walk as proud people with your God. But instead he's saying, walk humbly with your God. Even though you walk amongst all these pagans, worshiping a multitude of deities, your God is requiring you to do justice for those who have been done wrong. Your God is requiring you to embrace a faithful love to him, to be faithful to him, and to be faithful in love towards your neighbor, and to humbly walk with your God. The Hebrew word for prophet is nabi, and it's a common noun that's used over 300 times in our Old Testament. It means one who is called, or one who announces. Early prophets were called seers or visionaries who received their messages from God through either visions or dreams. They gave signs and warnings and predictions. And in the early period, ecstatic religious experiences characterized groups or schools of prophets. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 10. Later, another dimension of prophecy is developed, and prophets saw God interacting with history. The prophet clearly believes that God enters decisively into human history. The prophet sees, hears, understands what God is doing or is going to do, and often at great personal risk, they announce that reality to the people. And a particular risk was when they would have to confront a king themselves, knowing that that could very much be a death sentence for them. We hear that that fire just burns in their bones. We see that in Jeremiah 20, verse 9. Fire burns in their bones to tell the message the way that God has told it to them. They may be speaking to kings, just like Nathan spoke to King David. We read about that a few years ago when the prophet Nathan had to confront David about how he had sinned against Uriah by his adultery with Uriah's wife. In 2 Samuel chapter 12 is where we see that great confrontation. We also see it with Elijah when he spoke to Ahab this week in 1 Kings, particularly in chapter 21, about Naboth's vineyard. We see this happening when prophets have to speak to the people, the entire nation, or calling together the tribal elders, just as Amos spoke to the northern kingdom. But they all have this sense, the prophets all have this sense of being called to announce God's words and God's actions. Before the time of the kings of Israel, some people who were political or military leaders were also termed prophets. We see this, we see Moses called a prophet, Miriam and Deborah in both Exodus and Judges, they were called prophets because they had played these beautiful, eloquent roles in celebrating God's relationship with the people of Israel. Moses being called a prophet, not only because he knew God face to face as a friend, this is a quote from Exodus, but because he reported what God told him. He was a spokesperson to all of the tribes of Israel, speaking for God as his spokesperson, especially when he told them in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, he gave them God's words when he said, "I'll raise up a prophet for them from among their fellow Israelites, one just like you. I'll put my words in his mouth and he will tell them everything I command him." Now, when we look at what were these messages that the prophets brought, from this week's reading and through almost the rest of our Old Testament, when we're reading the words of the prophets, we see two themes really kind of come to the forefront. And these two themes, these two primary messages that God gives his prophets to tell the people, are still really powerful for us today. They are still messages that are utterly and completely relevant for us today. They may look a little different, but let's look at this. So the prophets were opposed to two primary things: paganism and injustice. Paganism meant not putting God first in their lives. Tell me that's not still relevant for ourselves and all of our people today. Absolutely. Paganism also, it meant kind of flirting with the gods of other tribes or other nations, forgetting that they were to be a unique, a very distinctive covenant community. If they ate unclean foods, neglected the Sabbath, intermarried with foreign peoples, worshiped on high hills, that was a practice of Baal worship, then the people were acting like a prostitute. That's what Jeremiah called them. When we see this term used a lot in reference to the people, whenever they were unfaithful to their covenant with God, Yahweh God, is they were considered to be like prostitutes or an adulterous woman because of their infidelity, their unfaithfulness. If Israel was to be God's chosen people, they had to be a distinctive, peculiar, unique people. If Israel was to be a light to the nations, as we read in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, when he calls Israel a light to the nations, then they would have to be an obedient people. Because remember, that was their role. Their whole purpose in being God's people was to be a light to the nations. They were to shine so brightly and so distinctly that they would illuminate to the whole world, to all the people around them, all the nations, all the tribes, all of the different people groups of the day would be able to see this shining bright example of God's glory through Israel. That was God's intent for Israel. And if they couldn't do that, if they couldn't stand out and shine brightly so differently from everyone else, illuminating and glorifying Yahweh God so that all people would be attracted to that light, so drawn to it that they had to come nearer and nearer and nearer, then what were they doing? If they were not fulfilling that role for God, God had to step in and do something. King Ahab, we read this week, he ruled from about 869 to 850 BC. So just to help us, because I always think it's funny when we talk about history and we talk about the years in the BC or BCE, before Common Era, it sometimes gets a little tricky because it's kind of reverse from our modern day years in AD. So when you think 800, King Ahab living around 869 to 850 BC, just remember that's 850 years before Jesus was born, okay? That's when he ruled the northern kingdom, like I said earlier, also called Israel. At this time in history, the northern kingdom was referred to as Israel, whereas before the entire nation had been called Israel. Now that they're split, the northern half is referred to as Israel. The prophet Elijah lived at this same time. So the prophet Elijah is the prophet that we see come to the forefront during the reign of King Ahab. And the prophet Elijah was furious with Ahab because Ahab had married a princess named Jezebel. She was a foreign princess who had permitted, that Ahab had allowed and permitted to establish Baal worship as an acceptable practice in Israel. We read this in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 33. So this foreign princess comes in, her husband, the king Ahab, allows her to bring her religion with her. We see that not only does she worship Baal, but she is like a prophetess or a priestess for Baal worship. And she brings in these idolatrous priests and prophets for Baal as well. And she's bringing them in, and she's really this horrific assault against Yahweh God, what she's bringing in. But notice from our readings that King Ahab accused Elijah of being the troublemaker here, right? Because people always accuse the prophets of being troublemakers because the prophets are always pointing out the evil that's being done. But Elijah answers King Ahab, I haven't troubled Israel. You and your father's house have. You did as much when you deserted the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. This was 1 Kings 18:18. So that's where we're going to spend a little bit of time today. And we're going to read a couple of passages of scripture. So if you have your Bible near at hand, which I hope you do every time we meet for class, pull out your Bible or open up your Bible app if you have a Bible app on your phone, if that's what you prefer to use. But we are going to be in 1 Kings chapter 18. And I'm going to read a couple of verses briefly, but then I'm going to ask a couple of others to read here in just a moment. Join me in 1 Kings chapter 18. And we're going to start at verse 16. So 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 16. And I want to set the scene for you just a little bit, because I found this incredibly powerful myself. A few years ago, I think it was a couple years before COVID hit, I had the blessing to be able to go to the Holy Land. And I was particularly excited to go to Mount Carmel, because this is a story that has been one of my favorites in the Old Testament for just years and years. And so on the day where we went up on top of Mount Carmel, it amazed me that when you are near the peak of Mount Carmel, you can look out. If you look to the east, you can look down and see this great valley. And it becomes a huge plain, it's just flat. And then beyond that are more mountains. And I think it's important to realize that there's not a ton of trees. There's no jungle. There's no dense forest. You can see down this mountain. You can see across this plain, and onto the next hills and mountains all around you. You can see as far as your eyes can permit you to see, to the point where hills, often the far distance, become hazy and blurry. And you can just see for what feels like forever. And it's like you're looking across this plain, and then you see this mountain over here, and this mountain over here, and this mountain over here. But if you look to the west, you can see the Mediterranean Sea, this vast, huge sea. And it's enormous, and it's just incredible. But I think what's beautiful about just being able to kind of picture in your mind, if you will, being on top of this mountain, having the sea to one side, and then being able to see across the land so far that your eyes just give out. You can't see any further. There's nothing obstructing your view. No dense forest, no dense jungle. It's just grassy plain down the mountain and further mountains beyond that. It was just beautiful and breathtaking. So that's where they are. This is in the northwestern part of Israel. And it's, like I said, it's a place that people can go and visit still today. There are cathedrals there, churches there that commemorate a lot of the things that happened there. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 16. And this is where King Ahab there's kind of this moment of confrontation, and we're introduced to Obadiah, who was a palace administrator. So a man with great administration skills, who also loved God. And what we read earlier on in this chapter is that Obadiah, while Queen Jezebel is off murdering all of the priests for God, the prophets of God, Obadiah, this administrative type for the palace, for King Ahab, he's secretly taking what's left of the prophets and he's hiding them. He's putting them in caves and hiding them. He's giving them food and water to keep them alive, because the queen of the land is off on a rampage and just ordering the execution of anyone that professes the name Yahweh God. And so this Obadiah comes across the great prophet Elijah. And that's where we are right now in the story. So in verse 16, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel and meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." Do these words sound familiar in any way? They might. Thinking about a couple of weeks ago in our lesson, when we hear Elijah confront the nation of Israel, he's talking to the whole assembly of people. He says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Elijah's calling the people out. He's challenging them, and for good reason. It's important to understand with Baal worship, Baal, like all pagan deities, were considered tied to the land. In antiquity, ancient peoples believed that a particular god was specific to a geographical region. So if you came into the land of Canaan, where Israel is, they believed the chief god there was Baal. If you were to travel to the land where the Philistines lived, they believed that the chief god Dagon lived there. If you went to, just depending on where you went, you would have a particular god that people believed was in charge of that part of the world, that part of the land. So in Canaan, also known as Israel, now that the Israelites are living there, the pagans of Canaan, they believed that Baal was their chief god, and he was a god of rain and thunder, also considered a war god. But he was a god that they would call upon whenever they needed rain, when they wanted fertility in the land, also fertility of the womb. But he was their chief deity. And part of Baal worship, we've talked about this in weeks previously, but just to kind of remind us, or if you weren't in that class, part of the ways that they would worship Baal was they would call upon him to bring rain and fertility on the land for good crops, for good birthing seasons, for their livestock. And one of the ways, or the primary way that they would do this, was in times of drought or times outside of the rainy season. Like, so in the heat of the summer, when they would want to call upon God, or their god, Baal, they believed he had gone to the underworld, and they wanted to call him back up and to bring fertility to the land. The way they would do that is they would reenact what they wanted Baal to do. And in their belief system, they believed that when if Baal were to come back from the underworld, that he would come back to come and mate with his counterpart, Asherah. We read throughout in a few places in our Old Testament about Asherah poles. And so that refers to how they would kind of designate his female counterpart. And in their belief system, they believed that when Baal came back from the underworld, he would bring rain and storms when he mated with his counterpart, Asherah. So in order to call him forth to do that, they would go to the high places where they had built altars towards Baal, and they would they would take on the services of shrine prostitutes, and they would reenact what they wanted Baal to do. So they would have sex with temple prostitutes, enacting what they wanted this god of fertility to do by coming back. So this all becomes intermixed in with Israel. And you can see why this might have been alluring, or this may have been a temptation for some of the Israelites. It was now becoming part of their culture. It was now proclaimed acceptable and desirable from their king and queen to partake in temple prostitution. This becomes a snare for the Israelite people for centuries upon centuries. They start seeing that part of pagan worship, there's some practices, part of pagan practices that seem kind of alluring, that seem like something they want to take part in, and it's something they can see and touch and feel. Whereas Yahweh God, they just have to trust a deity that they cannot see, they cannot touch, they cannot feel. And so you can see how this becomes a snare and a trap to them. So Elijah, this powerful prophet of God, he starts calling them out. He's doing what the prophet does. He is calling not only the people back to God, challenging them, saying, you've got to decide now. You can't have it both ways. You can't worship Baal and Yahweh at the same time. You've got to choose. He's also calling King Ahab back to account. Because remember, the king, he is supposed to be in charge of the nation. He is supposed to be the primary leader of the nation of God, making sure that they are faithful to Yahweh God and Yahweh God alone. So when we hear Elijah saying to the entire people of Israel in chapter 21, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. So this, like I said just a few minutes ago, this should sound familiar. We talked about something that sounded very much like this. And it happened about 550 years before this very moment. Remember when they first entered the promised land and they were warned, you're about to enter into a land, you're coming out of the desert, and now you're entering into this land promised to you by covenant. You're entering into a land where there's other ideas, other understandings, other gods that are being worshiped. So you've got to decide. So keep one hand in 1 Kings chapter 18 and turn back 500 years in time to the book of Joshua. And I'm going to ask if someone could read Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 through 18. Someone please unmute or raise your hand if someone can read Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 through 18. Is there someone that is willing to read or able to read? Please unmute yourself if you can. Oh, I see someone has unmuted. Please introduce yourself and read to us Joshua 24, 14 through 18.
This Pastor Sentamu Rajab.
Welcome.
Yes.
Joshua chapter 24, verses 14.
Now therefore,
This is how
fear
it
the
reads.
Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Verse 16. And the people answered and answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. Pastor Sentam Arajab.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. Yes. So remember, this was right before Joshua, is at the end of Joshua's leadership. Joshua had brought Israel into the promised land, had served as their leader once Moses died, conquers most of the land, brings them into the promised land, and towards the end of his time, before he dies, he's reminding the people of their covenant with God, reminding them what God had done and freeing them from slavery in Egypt, bringing them out of the land of Egypt and into the desert, how God had stayed with them, provided for them, guided them, and brought them to the promised land. And he said, before he's leaving, before he dies, he's like, okay, here we are now in the promised land. Here we are. but you've got to decide. Is it going to be Yahweh God, or is it going to be these other false gods? And at that moment in time, the people said in verse 16, far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. And they go on in the next couple verses. In verse 17, the people cry out to Joshua saying, it was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from the land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Now, they were able to respond to this challenge, this question. When their leader Joshua presents to them this challenge, you need to decide today, is it Yahweh God, or is it any other gods? But you've got to decide. Joshua said, for me and my household, it's going to be Yahweh God. But you all need to decide for yourselves. Who is it that you're going to follow? The gods of the land or Yahweh? And the people immediately respond by telling all the great things that God had done, what he had done for them, how he revealed himself to them. Now, they were able to do that because they remembered. They remembered who God was by what he had done and what God had done for them. Now, fast forward 500 years into the future, the people had been living in the land and they had been going back and forth, choosing between Baal and different deities, gods of water and rain, gods of sun and moon, and all these different gods, kind of lumping in Yahweh God amongst all these other deities, sometimes absolutely rebelling against God and just turning to full-on paganism. But when the prophet Elijah now has assembled all of Israel before him and says to them in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, Elijah went before the people and said, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And at the end of that verse, we read, but the people said nothing. They said nothing. There was silence. They weren't speaking for any God, but by their silence, they were making a choice. They were being complicit just by not even saying a thing. So let's see what happens from there on. Is there someone that could read? We're in 1 Kings chapter 18. And this is really, if you've never preached on this passage that we're about to read, I would encourage you to do so. And also, if you work with children's ministers or if you work with children yourself, this is a great story for kids because it's an easy story to see and understand. And it's really a point of decision where people are called to make a choice. Could somebody read 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 22 through 39? Verses 22 through 39.
Okay, let me read.
Thank you, Pastor Dennis.
My name is Havala. My name is Armstrong. Yeah, here it goes. 1 Kings chapter 18 from verses 22 to 39. This is how it reads. Then said Elijah and the people, I, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire under, and I will dress the other bullock, and lay it on the wood, and put it on the fire. 24. And call ye on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God that answered by fire, let him be God. And all the people answered and said, it is well spoken. 25. And Elijah said unto the prophets of Baal, choose you one bullock for yourself, and dress it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your gods, but put no fire under. And they took 26, and they took the bullock which was given unto them, and they dressed it, and called on the name of Baal from morning, evening until noon, saying, from morning even till noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor there that was answered. And they leaped up upon the altar which was made. 27. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, for he is a God, neither he is talking, for he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he is sleepeth, and must be awakened. 28. And they cried aloud, cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets, until the blood gushed out upon them. 29. And it came to pass, when midday was past, and they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that there was no neither voice, nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. Verse 30. And Elijah said unto all the people, come nearer, come to me. And all the people came nearer to him. And he replied, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. 31. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. 32. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 measures of the seed. 33. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bullocks in pieces, and laid him on the wood, and said, fill 4 bowls with water, and put it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. 34. And he said, do it the second time. And they did it the second time. And he said, do it the third time. And they did it the third time. 35. And the water ran round about the altar, and he filled the trench also with water. 36. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah, the prophet, came nearer and said, Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known that this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. 37. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that the people may know that thou art God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt of sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. 39. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. I love that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Oh, guys, I have to share with you. I did this story on Wednesdays. I teach an after-school program for children ages 5 through 11, and I've been teaching the Bible stories for this after-school program for almost 15 years now. Every Wednesday when kids get out of school, and the primary method I use for teaching children is I use little wooden, like little carved. I tell the story, little figures and on scenes, with grass and trees and everything, so that the children can really see it and they can remember it. And I'll tell you, children will remember, and oftentimes adults too, will remember things so much better if we can see it than if we can hear it. But this year, as I was teaching this story, and we had the people, and I had little rocks where Elijah was building the altar of God again, and he used 12 stones. And I want to say the children, they understood this so quickly and so fast. It was just a blessing. But I want to tell you about this experience because it stood out powerfully, and I think we'll understand it too. A couple things I want to remind us of. This moment happened in the 3rd year of this incredible drought. There was famine in the land. There's a horrific drought that was devastating the nation. So Elijah is challenging the prophets of Baal on a mountaintop that had been in famine and drought. And he's challenging these prophets of Baal who worship what they believe to be their head deity in charge of rain and fertility on the land. They're calling out to this God who's supposed to be in charge of rainfall and growth of crops and livestock. Yet they're in their 3rd year of drought and they've got nothing. The Baal prophets, they're yelling, they're screaming all day long, to the point where Prophet Elijah, he knows what's up, right? He knows you can call on Baal all day long if you want to, but maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's asleep. Yell louder. He even goes so far as to call them out and say, maybe your God's in the bathroom. Maybe he's on the toilet. Maybe that's why he's not answering you. It makes you wonder, Elijah was sassy. So Elijah's calling them out for their supposed water god to bring down rain to prove that he's God. And here comes Elijah. Once they give up, now it's Elijah's turn to call on Yahweh, who we know is the God of everything, God of all creation, God of all living, all plants, all rain, all water, all rivers, all oceans, sun, moon, creator God of all, right? And the way he's displaying God's power is he assembles 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And as I was telling this story to children this year, they understood right away, look at the water he pours out onto this sacrifice that he's asking Yahweh God to show up by fire. Show up by fire and show us that you are the one true living God. But just to make it so that there's no mistaking that this is coming from God, he's having water poured all over the sacrifice, all over the stones. He even creates a trench around this stone altar, and it's filled up, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And here's what the kids understood that I hadn't until then. He says in verse 33, he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. In verse 34, do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. So what the kids saw, because we were acting this out using little figures and rocks and little miniature jars, was the kids said, wait, he had them pour 12 jars of water all over the sacrifice, the wood and the stones. I had never picked that up. I had read, he told some guys with 4 jars to dump a bunch of water on it. But when you do the math, you have 4 men holding 4 jars filled with water. They poured their 4 jars on it, and he tells them to do it again. So there goes 4 more jars. Do it a 3rd time. There's 4 more jars. 4 times 3 is 12. It's as if Elijah is saying, our God, the God of Israel, the God representative of Israel as seen by the 12 tribes, laying this sacrifice on these 12 stones, covering it with 12 jugs of water. He is Yahweh God. And not only is he God of Israel, but he has dominion and control, and he's sovereign over even the water and the rain. You may think your God, Baal, is God that controls the rain and the fertility of the land, but that's my God. He controls even the water, and he shows up in fire. Think of all the times we've seen the presence of God revealed through either cloud or fire. We see that on Mount Sinai time and time again. Through the desert, we saw it in the 12 plagues. We see God show up even in the gospel accounts by the time Jesus comes, and there's still paganism running amok everywhere, paganism in all parts of the world, amongst the Greeks and the Romans by this time. With Jesus, we see miracle after miracle revealing that God even has control over the water, that most basic necessity of life. As Jesus performs miracles on the Sea of Galilee, as Jesus is walking on water, as he's calming the storm, as he is taking jugs of water and turning them to wine, our God Yahweh is the one true God who created all of the heavens and earth. He alone is sovereign over the wind and the waves, the rain and the land. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So we hear this story, and in verse 39, finally the people, after seeing this, they fall on their faces and cry, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." It's powerful, right? Oh, but before we carry on just a little bit further, are there any questions or thoughts from this story before we move on to further parts of our reading? I'm looking.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Pastor Jackson. Welcome.
I'm sorry, I was even printing a question, but it is fortunate that you requested for some questions before we proceed. At the reading of the scripture in First Kings,
Yes.
chapter number 18, look at verse number 38.
Mm-hmm.
It is a bit challenging my understanding.
Okay.
But the fact being that it was done by God, yes, it is possible. With God, everything is possible. But let's look at this verse. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice. That's okay. The wood, that's okay. Now look there. The stones and the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Could stones be eaten up by fire? This is my question. I don't know the impact that it left. If it really happened, there must have been something remarkable or memorial that would be read, even seen up to this day today. That because of the fire, the soil that was eaten up, maybe it be the virtue or the space became a lake or a water body or a place where it could gather some things. Well, it may look something small, but I'm just wondering. I've just noticed it. The stones were eaten up by fire. Are they eatable, really? Okay, that is it. Praise the Lord.
No, I love that question. I think it's interesting, and I think it's certainly something that, as our people read through Scripture, they're going to ask. Somebody's going to wonder this same question, and that it makes you wonder. First, I love that you, before you even reread the verse, you said, of course, all things are possible with God. And yes, ultimately, that is our answer. Of course, all things are possible with God. If he can call, all of the animals onto the ark for Noah, if he can flood the earth, if he could speak through a burning bush, of course, if he can raise the dead, of course, all things are possible with God. However, I don't want us to use that consistently as our excuse for everything only because we can't answer it in any other way. I think ultimately that is correct and absolutely an appropriate answer. However, when we're able to, I think it's also helpful for us to be able to help people understand. When I read that verse and we understand, my translation says, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up, it doesn't say eaten up, it's a minor translation difference, burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. It makes me wonder if this act of God, if the fire of God that came down in that moment, if that was not a bolt of lightning. I don't know. It could have been, or it could absolutely have been something of what looked like flames. We don't know. Unfortunately, we're not given that much detail in this moment. We just know that something hot enough to burn up stones themselves and water came from the sky. And so I wonder about if it could have been a bolt of lightning, because that is something we have seen in nature happen. When lightning strikes a sandy beach, we absolutely do see where stone is burned or almost like melted. And I would say, I don't know. I don't want to get too specific because I think it takes us far away from the point that the writers are trying to make in recording this story. But I will say, in Israel, they are particularly known for their limestone. I don't know. We don't know for certain what kind of stone this was, but limestone is known for being a very soft rock. It's easy to carve. Very different from granite or other or marble, which is known for its density being very hard. But limestone is the predominant stone in Israel, and it's very soft. But again, we don't know what kind of stone this was, but we do know that stone is capable of being affected by fire, because we've seen fire damage when a fire can get hot enough. I think ultimately the main point that the writers are trying to make in recording this story was that Elijah went out of his way to make it, to set up a circumstance, to set up a scene that only a true act of a true God could affect it. That's why he's dumping all this water on it. You don't see, we don't see the Baal prophets doing that, but we do see Elijah as if to say, only an act of God can consume this at this point because it is drenched with water. So it's not going to be through some trickery. It's not going to be through some kind of illusion that a human is doing. It's not as if I'm going to spark a fire onto this kind of behind my back and say that it's from God. No, that would be impossible because it is soaking wet through 12 huge jugs of water being dumped on it. So only an act of God. And then God shows up and confirms again, yeah, no human could have replicated this kind of miraculous scene. This is truly by my own hand because only an act of God could consume water by fire, let alone stones by fire. So I think that's the primary point, that this is why this story has been preserved for us throughout millennia, is because I think it's important still for us today to understand that while we can disprove a lot of unusual things that we've seen and heard of, God wants us to understand that he can still do some things that we cannot even imagine. Our God is still so above and beyond us and can act in such ways that he can demonstrate himself to not be anything of this world. He's not human. He is our God. And so therefore he can act in ways, and he can be powerful in ways that we just cannot conceive of because they are only truly from God. So that's how I'd respond to that. So I think I'm going to kind of in our last few minutes, I want to move on for just a moment, because it is important to understand that the role of prophet was not only to call the people back to faithful adoration and worship and relationship with God, but also their secondary role, or just as important, because remember, at the very beginning of this class, we talked about the role of the prophets in the Old Testament was really to oppose two things: paganism, but then also injustice. And this was that second concern that the prophets had, was towards injustice. So when Israel and Judah did not put God first in their lives, they began to put themselves first. And this is important to recognize, because we still today do the same thing. If we are not putting God first, we're putting ourselves first. We're putting our own families first. We're putting our own concerns first. And so this is something that is still relevant for us today. If someone asks you, is the Old Testament still relevant for Christian believers today? Absolutely. The prophets, the spokespeople of God, were speaking just as much for the people then as they are for us today, when they call us to remember that we are to cry out against injustice among our people. So the people of Israel, or the prophets of Israel and of Judah, they're calling the people to put God first in their lives and not themselves. When the people put themselves first, when they were not elevating God to his proper place as first and foremost in their lives, as a result of that, they began to lack consideration for their neighbor. They lost compassion for those who had less, those who were weak. The prophets then, sensing that destruction was coming, first from the Assyrians and then later from the Babylonians, which we're about to read next week, they announced that these disasters were coming as punishments. The people of Israel, they warned, would be destroyed and exiled because of their refusal to take seriously their covenant responsibility for compassion and justice. Compassion and justice. And I think it's important to remember, I keep talking about the prophets calling the people back to covenant faithfulness. And what we're talking about here is, when we look at its core, the 10 Commandments, we spoke about this some weeks ago, and many of you were able to quickly understand, when you look at our 10 Commandments, it becomes very clear to see that all 10 Commandments are how to treat God, how to be in relationship with God, or they're in how to be in relationship with others. But all 10 of those teach us how to live, act, how to function, how to be in relationship with God and with other people. And when Christ was asked, what's the most important of the commandments? He said, well, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, but then also love others as you love yourself. Love others the way I love you. It all goes back to loving God and loving others. And so when the prophets come and they're giving messages, warnings, they're calling people back, their two main messages are: be faithful to God, love God, keep him number one, but then love people. Look out for those who can't look out for themselves. Rise up against injustice. Have compassion and mercy for those who are the least, last, and lost among us. So we see this. You should be seeing in powerful waves how our Old and New Testament is utterly woven together as one tapestry. The law of God and the life of Christ, he's living that out. He's teaching us. He's like a walking embodiment of God's law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love others. Look out for the least, the last, and the lost. I mean, the entire Gospel of Luke is practically a walking, living, breathing advertisement on loving those who have less. that are less, that are seen as less, or not seen at all. So when we look at this role of prophets and their secondary message of calling the people, warning them to not to neglect works of social justice, we see that religious responsibilities, political responsibilities, economic responsibilities, all of life was included in the divine perspective. God's vision was a new social community in which everyone would have an integral part. Everyone was to be included. A radically free God was trying to form a radically just and caring people. God wanted the covenant people to model justice in the world. Remember, we talked earlier about how the nation of Israel was to be a light unto all the nations. And this is one of the ways they were going to be distinct and unique and stand out so that all the world would just stop and say, oh my gosh, look at what they're doing. That's different. What's going on there? And they would lean in and want to know more. And not only were they looking different and unique and being a light by eating differently, looking differently, interacting with others differently, it was the way they were the way they were called to extend mercy and justice. Even when the rest of the world would think you have every reason to act out in vengeance or to turn away from someone, God said, no, not you, not my children. I'm calling you to love everyone. And Jesus comes on the scene and goes a step farther and says, I even want you to love your enemies. And that is a hard message. But we see in Deuteronomy, when God is giving the law to Moses, we're reminded in Deuteronomy chapter 15, there won't be any poor persons among you, only if you carefully obey the Lord your God's voice. You must open your hand generously to your fellow Israelites, to the needy among you, and to the poor who live in your land. But now we saw and we see time and time again throughout our Old Testament, throughout the history of Israel, that Israel fails at this again and again and again. Self-interest prevailed. Love of God declined, and so did love of their neighbor. These are the same challenges and struggles we have today. These are the same things that your neighbors are struggling with, your family is struggling with. Sometimes we ourselves struggle with. Same challenges, same answer. Now, when we looked in Amos for descriptions of what it was that the people were doing, we saw this when we read through the book of Amos this week. We saw Amos describing what specifically the people were doing or not doing in how they treated people around them. Remember that transgression or sinning again and again is not just failing or forgetting. It is aggressive rebellion. It's rebellion, and it's an active revolt against the established authority of Almighty God. And that's what Amos was speaking out to. That's what Isaiah spoke out to. That's what prophet after prophet, God sent them messages. Remember, the people of Israel, they couldn't just go to the shelf in their house and pull a Bible down and read what God wanted them to do. They did not have a Bible yet. No one on their street had a Bible yet. There was no Bible yet. No one had a scroll of Genesis or Deuteronomy tucked away somewhere in their homes. This was not yet put in, these were not yet printed materials that were mass distributed throughout communities. If they wanted to hear a word from God, if they wanted to know what God's will was, if they wanted to be reminded of what God has said in the past or what God would say to them today, they didn't open up a Bible. They went to a prophet. They went and heard a prophet. They would be reminded of the words of God through the priests, but they didn't even have synagogues yet at this moment in history. So to really know the word of God, they were completely dependent on the prophets, and God was showing up. God was sending them prophets. God was sending them his word time and time again to remind them and to call them back. Of special importance, Amos, like other prophets, condemned